Hi there, nutrition and wellness students. Welcome to week 4, which is about fats. You'll notice my subtitle here. As always, I want to know if you did the reading first because I recommend that you do the week's reading before you watch the lecture video so you can get maximal benefit out of the video, in which I will assume you've already kind of looked at some of the stuff in the reading. I'll also note that the readings, the videos, the lab demonstrations, all that kind of stuff, please be taking notes during these because then when you take the quiz at the end of the week, you can use these notes on the quiz. It'll make the quiz a lot easier for you, especially the open-ended questions, but all the questions really. So let's launch right into it. In the previous week, I talked to you about carbohydrates, and I talked to you about how they're basically a series of monomers that are put together to make chains called polymers. And those chains might be just like a straight chain, or they might be branched like the one on the bottom right here. The most typical monomer we learned is glucose, and one polymer that's in your muscles is called glycogen. So that's cool. What I want to emphasize this week is fats are not a monomer polymer thing. We're going to come back to other molecules in your body that are polymers. You might already kind of know from biology class that proteins and DNA, those are polymers as well. Fats are kind of the exception here. They're not polymers. And instead, they look like this. So they're made of a small 3-carbon molecule called glycerol. You can see it in the left there, left of the slide in red. And glycerol has attached to it fatty acids. And fatty acids are pretty much chains of carbon and hydrogen. You see those here in blue. You'll often hear the term triglyceride, which is how fats are usually manifested in living tissue. So it's usually the way that that you'd find fat in an organism. You'd find it in this form of a triglyceride. And it is kind of what it sounds like if you break down the word. Tri meaning 3, glyceride referring to glycerol with 3 fatty acids stuck to it. So that's what that looks like in that picture. And in case you're wondering, if you're not familiar with organic chemistry terminology, which I kind of figure you might not be, these chains that you see drawn here, they're showing no actual atoms, but the assumption is that at each corner, there's a carbon atom, and stuck to it to round out the 4 bonds that carbon always likes to make. You can see like this carbon is making a bond with that carbon and a bond with that carbon, and then it must have 2 other hydrogens stuck to it. This carbon is making 1 bond with this carbon and 2 bonds with this carbon, so it must have a 4th bond with hydrogen stuck to it, as shown up here, right? So the assumption with these chains is that each corner, each kind of like spot where it changes direction has a carbon, and then carbon always makes 4 bonds. So there are an appropriate number of hydrogens to make the number of bonds around that carbon total to 4. Now I'm showing you here a few different types of fatty acids, and I want to take you through what this is a little bit. Maybe it makes it a little bit more friendly. This is kind of why I delayed recording this video until I was at school today. I would have normally recorded it on Sunday so I could post it for you then. But I thought you'd benefit from seeing these actual models. Maybe it's on video, so it's still just like not something you can hold in your hand, but it might look a little bit more understandable, right? So first, let's start with this one. This is a relatively short chain of carbons, which are black, and hydrogens, which are white, that are stuck to, this what's called a carboxylic acid head, and we're not going to need to worry about that level of detail. So basically, we're just thinking it's a chain of carbons and hydrogens, and this is what's called a saturated fat. What you'll notice is there are no double bonds in the chain. And so that means that there are as many hydrogens as possible stuck to these carbons, right? We've got 3 on this one on the end, and then 2 on every other carbon. Okay, so this is called a saturated fat. You've probably heard of that. This is what it is. Let's take a look at this fat instead. You'll notice this fat conspicuously has this double bond, right? And this double bond is minimizing the number of hydrogens. Well, not maybe minimizing, but it's reducing the number of hydrogens. It's making it so that these carbons only have 1 hydrogen stuck to them because they've got 1, 2, 3 bonds, 1, 2, 3 bonds already going on because of the double bond. So we call this unsaturated. Unsaturated with what? Unsaturated with hydrogen. There are fewer hydrogens here than there would be if this were a single bond. So unsaturated fat has a double bond. Now, if you look at nutritional labels, this is why I started there, because these types of things will be mentioned on them. This would be called a monounsaturated fat because there is one double bond. If there were 2 or 3 double bonds, we'd call it a polyunsaturated fat, 2 or 3 or more double bonds in the carbon backbone of the fat. Now, the other terminology that you probably know that goes along with fats is there's trans fat, okay? And then there's also something called omega-3s, which you may have heard of. If you've ever taken like a fish oil supplement, or if you've heard that salmon is good for you because it's got a lot of omega-3s, then you've heard of omega-3s. And indeed, those are important features. Let me show you a little bit about, in this model, and then I'll show you back on the slides, a little bit about what we mean when we say trans fat, and a little bit about what we mean when we say omega-3 or omega whatever else, okay? So this is a trans fat. And the reason you can tell that is if I take this double bond and I put it so it's flat, see how it's like flat in front of me, okay? I can see that the chain of carbons is going from the top, from above the plane of the bond, if this is the plane of the bond, right? It's going from above it to below. The prefix trans means across, so the chain is going across the plane of the bond. Now, I could just quickly switch this for you by popping this apart. And now we've got the opposite of a trans fat. Do you see how now when I look at the plane of the bond, I lay it flat in front of my eyes, it comes from above and it stays above. That may not seem like such a big deal, but look at this. Because of the double bond, you can't rotate. So I had to actually like chemically transform, like actually chemically remove this part and chemically stick it there in order to change it from one form to another, right? And so what that means is this doesn't just physically transform, it's actually a chemically different substance. Now, trans fat is not a very abundant, naturally occurring fat. Generally, it doesn't occur in large quantities naturally, which means that it's not typical to find it in foods. It's not typical to find it in organisms. It's not typical to find it in you. And if it finds its way into you, your body doesn't function quite as well with it there for a number of different reasons that have to do with its application. So trans fat is not healthy because it is not a naturally occurring fat in any kind of abundance. This, on the other hand, cis fat, this is cis monounsaturated fat. This is a really nice healthy fat in moderation. In fact, this one is particularly good, and I'm going to show you the last terminology here that has to do with fatty acids and fats, right? If we look at the end that has the oxygen atoms in red, we consider that the beginning of the chain. And we could say the A part of the chain, like A is the beginning of the alphabet, or we could be fancy and scientists about it and say it's the alpha part because, you know, Greek is so classic. So this is the alpha carbon. And the last letter, of course, and those of you who, you know, go to like a Sacred Heart school might know the quote, I am the alpha and the omega. That really means I am the A and the Z. I'm all the letters in the alphabet. I'm everything. Alpha, omega. Okay, so you may have heard of omega-3 fat being good. Omega-3 means 1, 2, 3 bonds back from the omega is unsaturated. Okay, now if this were a single bond here and we had to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 before we hit the double bonds, that would be called omega-6 fat. In general, it's good to have unsaturated fats because of the properties that they give your cells when you consume them. It's better to have some unsaturated fats in your diet. And having a mixture of the different omegas is important. We might take an omega-3 supplement because a lot of us get plenty of other types of omega, but might be kind of deficient in omega-3 for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. So I hope that kind of helps you to think about these fats. I'm going to switch back over to my slides and continue to talk you through them here. So hopefully you'll get more reinforcement. Okay. So first of all, let's think about where you'd find these different types of fat and why you'd find them in those places. So saturated fat, like the one that I showed you that has as many hydrogens as possible, no double bonds in the carbon backbone. Saturated fat is basically animal fat. I mean, you'll find it other places. In reality, all organisms are a mixture of these things. It's really which one are they heavier in than others, right? Animal fat is going to be a lot heavier in saturated fat. Saturated fat is often, especially in animals, it's a fairly long chain of carbons and hydrogens, pretty long. And that combination of being kind of bulky and also unsaturated leads to it being a solid at room temperature. And you can kind of see that here, right? Like a block of butter is more or less solid. A block of cheese is solid. Fat in a steak, as you can see in the picture, is more or less solid, right? If you raise the temperature, like if you cook it, you can definitely get it to melt. It doesn't take too much to get it to do that, but tends to be solid at room temp. Now, milk is kind of an exception, but we're going to talk more about that. Milk does have a good bit of saturated fat in it because it is animal fat, but milk has a special situation to it. Okay, the fat in milk is actually covered in a protein called casein. And casein, its job is to stick to the fat and also dissolve in water. So it has this property of being able to mix with fat. And I think you know water and fat, water and oil, they don't mix. If you dump water on fat, it doesn't dissolve it. So this casein is a protein that lines the fat in milk and makes it so the fat can dissolve in water. When you actually make cheese, and I posted a recipe if you want to try to make your own cheese, it's a really simple recipe for doing it. When you make cheese, what you're basically doing is getting the casein to either change its chemical properties and start to clump together, its physical and chemical properties and start to clump together, or you're actually processing it with a special enzyme, which removes the casein and causes all that fat to clump together. So it's kind of crazy to, like, if you dump vinegar into milk, it will do this. It's really considered the milk spoiling. And if you've seen spoiled milk, this is what the fat in it does. It's because the casein has been removed from the fat droplets and they've started to clump together. If you do it if you let milk sit on the table for long enough, it'll do this, but it'll be rotten. So you don't want to eat it. But if you do it in a controlled way, you can control how it happens and you can control what kinds of organisms might live there and they can give it tasty flavors and you can sell it as cheese. This is also why some cheeses are kind of stinky. Some of the organisms that show up under those circumstances might be a little bit stinky and intense, right? So at any rate, saturated fats are the story in animals. I posted another video on cheese making, so you can take a look at it and learn more about that. Now, again, saturated fats, like we'll come back to like health effects at the end of the presentation, but it tends to be that because we can access so much meat, we might eat a lot of meals that feature an animal protein. Those probably have a good bit of saturated fat in them. And so it's not that saturated fat is bad for you per se. It's just that we're probably already eating plenty, probably more than enough of it. And so often you might get the recommendation for a Western diet like ours that reducing saturated fat intake is a good idea. It's not because you should have zero of it, but because we're probably eating too much of it given what we eat. On the other hand, unless you make a point of eating fish and fish that is rich in omega-3 fatty acids like salmon, you may not be getting quite enough omega-3 fatty acids. Again, omega-3 are the fatty acids that are unsaturated, so they have a double bond in them. And in this case, they have a double bond that is 3 back from the omega carbon of the fatty acid. You can even take these as supplements, right? And you'll notice the supplement that I put here, some of you may even take something like this. It's coming from fish. So fish are an excellent source of omega-3s. I also found it interesting, referencing back to what I said in the week 2 materials, where I talked about nutritional labeling. I emphasized to you that the way things are raised influences their nutritive content. So here's an interesting image. A analysis that was conducted of wild salmon versus farm salmon, in this case demonstrated that farm salmon are much higher in fats, but that it's not that they're higher in omega-3s, it's that they're higher in saturated fat. And that has a lot to do with what they're being fed and with the way their metabolism is functioning, the way that their bodies are processing their food and making their own tissues under the circumstances of being trapped in a little pen. If you don't know what a fish farm is, you could look it up. It's basically a little pen out in the ocean that holds fish in it, and they can be fed kind of like cows on, in a feedlot where they're all kind of crunched together and fed corn until they get fat. Doesn't make the most healthful fish, as it turns out. So the recommendation here would be wild salmon is a better option to get those omega-3s. Plus, notice that it's also got good mineral content like calcium, iron, potassium, zinc, other micronutrients that you need in your diet. It's a nice little tie in there. So omega-3 is something we're often deficient in. We might take it as a supplement, or we might eat it from a whole food like wild salmon, which would be a good option in this case. Omega-6 is a different fatty acid that we often get a lot of. Americans, if you analyzed our bodies and looked into, where did the carbon in our bodies come from originally? I mean, some of it would have come from a cow, but the cow didn't do photosynthesis. So if you look at which plant was at the bottom of the food chain that we eventually ate, it's basically corn. If you analyze the average American, a lot of the photosynthesis that went into organisms that eventually up through food chains became me, the starting plant was corn. Because in America, we grow an incredible amount of it. So because of that, omega-6 fatty acids, which are not inherently bad, they're actually unsaturated fat, which is great. But omega-6 fatty acids are a little overabundant relative to omega-3s. That's another reason why you might try to eat omega-3s, is because you're probably getting a lot of omega-6 already. If you can reduce omega-6, that's fine. If you can take enough omega-3 to balance it, that's the ideal situation. A healthy balance of omega-3s and omega-6s. I thought I'd also show you this because it's something that goes on at my Sacred Heart School. So this is olive processing and production of olive oil. And these are actually olives that we harvested a couple of years ago from the olive grove in our school's farm and garden program. We have about an acre farm on my campus, a bunch of animals and a bunch of olive trees, among other things. This is what olive trees look like in context. This is an olive tree farm up in Napa where we processed our olives. You may know Napa as wine country. It's also olive country, and no surprise there. They grow in the same places globally. You might go to Italy for wine and for olive oil. So out here in California, we have a similar climate to the Mediterranean, and we have a similar set of produce we can produce. So these are our olives going into a machine that slices them all up, macerates them into this kind of pasty mess. The pasty mess is shot out as this stuff called pomace, which has had the oil spun out of it. And this is what the oil looks like that's been spun out. So here's the leftovers up in the top right, and here's the stuff we got out. This machine is what separated it. You'll notice our olive oil is incredibly good stuff. It's not only rich in unsaturated fats, especially monounsaturated omega-9s. And if you're not following me, rewatch the video. You'll get it. You'll get it. It's just a little bit weird terminology. It's not only rich in monounsaturated omega-9s, it's also rich in what are called phytonutrients. You can see it as the green stuff here. Phyto means plant. Nutrients, of course, things that are healthful. Those phytonutrients are all kinds of micronutrients that you won't get in a mass-produced olive oil that you will get in a handmade olive oil like ours. Ours is very expensive. We sell it for I think more than $30 for a little 375 milliliter at our charity auction every year. And it's a fundraising thing. I'm sure we might not be able to sell it for that much in a store, but it's a very boutique-y, very high quality and very delicious olive oil. I always look forward to getting my one little gift bottle from the Farm and Garden program because they're my friends and because my classes go over and help with the harvest. So at any rate, that's a nice little connection to my own Sacred Heart School. Maybe you have your own connection. Maybe, I don't know, for those of you who are in fishing territory, do you do anything fishing related? Maybe our school up in Halifax, where there's a lot of fishing that goes on. I don't know. Let me know if you have any connections to food production at your school. I'd love to hear it. Now, so we've talked about saturated fat in animals, unsaturated fat. You'll notice it's mostly in plants. Let's talk about the other one, which is trans fat. Now, again, you want to avoid this generally. It is not a natural fat. It is not a healthful thing to be consuming. It does not have a natural shape to it. And when you build yourself out of that fat, which is what you do with your food, you build yourself out of it. When you build yourself out of that fat, it does not contribute to the highest functioning of your body. I could go into more detail, but I'm going to leave it there because I don't want to make it get too complicated here. I think I'm already throwing a good bit at you. Places where you might find trans fat, surely you want to know. Well, margarine is kind of a classic place that you'd find it. The idea behind margarine, and I chose this package because you can kind of see the deal here, it's vegetable oil, so it's not supposed to be really solid. And what they do with it is they take unsaturated fats from vegetable oils. And this is kind of a big thing from like war times where fat became scarcer. Animals to make butter became scarcer. And so there's enough vegetable oil around that, like, let's take some corn oil and see if we can make, like saturated fats out of it. So let's imagine I take like an omega-3, and I'll unshare my screen for a second here to show you this. Let's imagine I take an omega-3 and I want to turn it into a saturated fat. Well, you know that what I have to do is blast this apart here and turn it into a single bond and attach extra hydrogens there, right? There's a name for that process. It's called hydrogenation. Have you ever looked on a label and seen something like partially hydrogenated oil? That's what it is. It means they've actually chemically reacted hydrogens with this chain to get the the double bonds to pop apart, and in order to make it saturated. The problem is when you do that, some of them will chemically pop apart and decide, nah, actually, I'm good with becoming a saturated fat. I'm not going to stay in that form. Instead, I'm going to actually like flip around, right? And when that happens, what you end up with is a trans fat. So let me kind of make that clear here. So pops apart, flips around, sticks back together. Now you're stuck in the trans setting. The reality is that when you hydrogenate an oil, mostly what's happening is that it is turning to saturated fat, and the saturated fat is solid, and you can sell that as a butter-like substance called margarine. However, some of it will flip around and connect back as trans fat, which means in anything that is hydrogenated, you're probably going to want to avoid it. In anything that is hydrogenated, there will be trans fat. Now you might say, no, but I've seen that on an ingredient label, and then I also looked and it said 0 grams trans fat. There's a messed up thing here with regard to labeling. If your food contains less than 0.5 grams of trans fat, you can say it has 0. You can round down, which is kind of ridiculous. You can basically claim 0 trans fat, even though you don't have 0 trans fat because you have less than 0.5 grams. So of course, it is kind of it's not the most abundant thing in margarine or the most abundant thing in palm oil, which is another source of it. And by the way, palm oil is in a lot of things, like Nutella has palm oil, and I hate that because Nutella is delicious, but it's got trans fat. And again, consuming trans fat in any quantity is not particularly healthy. So even if the label says 0 grams trans fat, word to the wise, if it has hydrogenated oils or palm oil in it, the way palm oil is extracted causes trans fat to form, avoid it. It's unfortunate, but true. So here's the chart that I'm going to leave you with. I've said enough, I think. So what I'm going to recommend is that you take a look at this on your own and kind of read through it. The slides are also posted, so you can take a look at them. Notice that, again, like health impacts and recommendations are on the right. So they're telling you what it does to risk of heart disease. They're telling you, like, how much could you get away with consuming here? What are the recommendations anyhow? And what it does to your cholesterol, both like the bad and good forms, quote unquote, the ones that are more problematic and the ones that are more healthful, and the total cholesterol, and then adding in any other information that might be relevant. So do take a look at it, look at those examples of sources of these different types of fats. This is the kind of thing I could ask you a little bit about on the quiz. So definitely, like kind of try to know what are some sources of good fats? What are some sources of not so good fats? What are some sources of omega-3s? What are some sources of mono and polyunsaturated fats? So those tend to be more healthful. And what are some places where you might find trans fat, unfortunately? Thanks for your attention. I hope this video is interesting. And if any of this stuff is too much, reach out. I'm happy to help you to think through how this chemistry works. It's worth it to try to understand what's underlying what's going on here, right? It's like if you get into this, you really understand what you're eating. That matters. So thanks for your effort.